Chairman Powell has probably rarely seen the housing market so dominated by fixed-rate mortgages. It's hard to make a direct comparison, but I think he's reflecting on different factors here. The Fed has a dual mandate, balancing inflation, growth, and maintaining maximum employment. So they absolutely can't afford to risk disrupting everything else solely because they want to address this persistent housing inflation issue. So in a way, they're distancing themselves, saying, no, this isn't our issue, this isn't our responsibility. Instead, they seem to be targeting employment now by implementing the 50 basis point cut. That's how I would interpret it.
Yes, we're continuing on with part 2 of our insightful conversation with the beloved director Oh Gun-young. Let's keep pushing forward with determination.
Yes, so you mentioned earlier about, so if we lower interest rates and inject money into the system while simultaneously performing quantitative tightening, what ultimately happens to market liquidity in that scenario? Well, we don't really know, but let me put it this way. Quantitative easing wasn't even conceptualized until the 2000s, when Japan first introduced it as a monetary policy. Because the banking system was failing, the collapse of Japan's bubble left their entire banking sector in ruins. Since the banks couldn't operate, the central bank had to step in, injecting capital to keep them afloat. So while the banks were essentially dead, they weren't allowed to fail. The hope was that eventually they would start lending again. Now, if the US banking system successfully revives and banks genuinely begin lending again at full capacity, but banks only increase lending when the real economy improves. So if US commercial banks rapidly increase their lending, then even with quantitative tightening, reducing reserve balances, liquidity only happens when those reserves leave the bank's balance sheets, right? So the key question is how much lending they're doing. Even if reserves are reduced, if lending takes off, the money supply multiplier effect kicks in and drives growth. So ideally, even with rate hikes or quantitative tightening in place, if the real economy is genuinely improving, money will begin flowing back into the system. In that case, even if the central bank absorbs money through tightening, banks can still inject liquidity into the economy with loans. At that point, there could actually be a noticeable increase in real liquidity circulating within the economy. So the question now becomes where the US real economy currently stands.
In a way, that also answers the question, will liquidity increase if rates are lowered?
Yes, but since we're on the topic, let's briefly detour for a moment. In early September, market sentiment was quite negative. People were saying, oh, this is bad. By the second week of September, even before the Fed cut rates by 50 BP, the market began to turn around. The first reason is Jensen Huang came out and said, Nvidia is doing great. That was the initial trigger, but that alone wasn't sufficient to create momentum. The second trigger came when journalist Nick Timiraos spread the rumor that the Fed would cut rates by 50 basis points, which caused quite a stir in the market. But there was a third factor, something not many people pay attention to. The third factor involves a man named Michael Barr. Who is Michael Barr? He's the vice chair of the Fed, and he basically oversees financial regulation. Yes, back in March last year, when SVB went bankrupt, Michael Barr stepped up, clearly furious. He said, this is unacceptable. Banks can't operate like this. You must increase reserves, then pushed for doubling their capital reserves. People were shocked, saying, how is this even possible? So there was a huge uproar about increasing bank capital, and they pushed for much stricter regulations. They aimed to raise capital requirements for large banks and introduce new regulations for small and medium-sized banks that previously lacked them. If capital regulations are imposed, banks will need to set aside money for reserves that could have been used for loans. That reduces bank profitability. They're thinking, this isn't sustainable, we might go under. It also created tension within the Fed. I think Wall Street bankers have been heavily lobbying politicians to prevent this from happening. Then last week, Michael Barr appeared, apologized, and announced there would be no new regulations for small and medium-sized banks. For the large banks, he requested a small increase in capital reserves. When the US benchmark rate drops, the short-term rate typically falls, while the long-term rate rises, resulting in an inversion of the yield curve. Commercial banks generally borrow on a short-term basis and lend over the long term. With the regulatory uncertainty gone, the gap between the two rates widens. That makes it easier for banks to issue loans. And if the real economy can absorb it, then even if capital markets outside the banks experience some tightening, banks can still step in and fill the gap by actively pumping out more loans. That could serve as a stabilizing factor, limiting the possibility of a large-scale recession in the US economy as we might currently imagine.
Yes, I understand. So that's what happened. Shall we now look into the interpretation of the 50 basis point cut from this FOMC?
Honestly, regarding that 50 BP cut, I also expected them to lower by just 25 BP because, well, I was wrong, but if I had to make an excuse, here's why. First, though, there was this factor, like the August employment report released earlier this month wasn't that bad. I mean, was it great? No, but it wasn't bad either. Employment increased by about 100. It could have been lower, but even if it had dropped to around 100,000, it would have been fine. So employment wasn't in bad shape. And that's the first point. The second point is inflation in the US, especially housing prices, started to creep back up. It's hard to be reassured, especially with the housing market. It seems reaching 2% inflation will be tougher than expected as the latest data came out stronger. At that point, I thought a 25 basis point cut was already a given. The third reason was that just before this FOMC meeting, US retail sales and industrial production data were released. Both reports came out solid, not bad at all. Seeing that, I thought, is there really a need for a 50 basis point cut? So after hearing what Nick Timmerhouse said and various other signals, I started wondering if a 50 basis point cut was coming. Still, I was expecting 25 BP. But when I woke up in the morning and saw 50, my eyes widened in surprise. I was curious, why did this happen? Of course, Chairman Powell held a press conference. Naturally, reporters thinking the same thing started bombarding him with questions, asking exactly what I was wondering. They asked, employment was good, inflation was high, retail and industrial data were strong, so why did you cut by 50 basis points? You said in July you weren't considering 50 basis points. Why change now? So let me briefly summarize a few key points that Powell made during the press conference. First point, the first thing he said was, when asked, Timmerhouse pointedly questioned, "You were late with this decision, weren't you?" Powell responded, No, we weren't late at all." You have to phrase these questions carefully. Who's going to admit, "Yeah, I'm an idiot, I messed up," when asked like that?
Basically asking Powell, weren't you a bit late in cutting rates?
He firmly said, absolutely not. This reporter asked a really good question. You remember back in July, around the end of July and beginning of August, when that economic data was released, it came out pretty bad. So at the July FOMC meeting, people asked, hey, if you'd factored in that data at the time, what would you have done? During the press conference, they asked, if you had considered that data, wouldn't you have cut rates? Powell responded with something non-committal like, maybe, maybe not. So someone asked again, since you didn't cut rates in July, did that factor into your decision now? Powell didn't admit they were late. Then he was asked if not cutting rates in July had been a concern of his. Powell neither confirmed nor denied it. So when you look at that, you realize they were being very cautious. So what this means is, the first thing seems to be that they probably felt they should have cut rates in July, but they were a bit late. Yes, but to be honest, that's not a huge factor. The bigger issue is the second point. There seems to be a significant difference in how they're viewing employment. This difference in how they're looking at employment goes like this. Let me explain. Earlier, I mentioned that if employment increases by around 100,000, that's considered decent, right? I was taught the same. 100,000 is a good benchmark. If 100,000 people are hired, that isn't too bad. But here's what Powell came out and said. Even with 100,000 jobs, there could be a problem because there's been a huge influx of immigrants. In the past, the workforce grew by about 110,000 each year, so the number of people available for work increased by 110,000 each month. If 110,000 people are joining the workforce every month and 100,000 jobs are created each month, the unemployment rate stays stable. But now with the surge in immigration...
You suddenly need a lot more jobs?
Exactly. If you're still creating just 100,000 jobs, then unemployment goes up because there are more vacant positions. So Powell says 100,000 jobs is no longer enough. At the current economic level, if we continue creating only 100,000 jobs each month, the unemployment rate will inevitably rise. That's what he's saying. The world has changed. Interestingly, a guy named Goolsbee said the same thing a week before. Goolsbee made those comments a week before Powell's 50 basis point cut, and Powell echoed the same thoughts later. So the takeaway this time is, pay attention to Goolsbee. Goolsbee is Powell's closest confidant. Instead of looking at Timmerhouse, we should be focusing on Goolsbee. The second thing Powell discussed, let's keep it simple here, avoiding any complicated terms or jargon. This is the state of US jobs right now. Initially, there were 6 million workers available in the labor market, while there were a staggering 12 million job vacancies waiting to be filled. So that's 2 job openings for every 1 worker, a 1.2 ratio. When every worker has 2 job options, they can pick and choose. That means we're short by 6 million workers. So after strong tightening, what happens is the number of vacancies starts decreasing. If workers can choose, which jobs do you think they'll go for? Usually when they have options, they'll choose the jobs that pay the most, right? That drives wages up. If that situation continues, rising wages will fuel inflationary pressures, which is why the thinking is that maintaining high interest rates will start reducing jobs. Yes, so jobs have decreased and now we're down to 6 million, reaching 1:1 ratio. We're at 1.1 now, but let's take a look at what this means. Even with a 1.1 ratio, if we maintain high interest rates, jobs will decrease further. At that point, it's not just about having fewer options, it's about jobs disappearing entirely. From then on, the unemployment rate could start rising significantly. So what we've seen so far and what's to come will look very different. The first point is that immigration has increased. And second, the ratio of job vacancies to workers is now 1:1. From this point, if jobs decrease, it will be directly reflected in the unemployment rate, which could cause a sharp rise in unemployment. Why is this happening? Some might say it's because the economy is strong and immigrants are arriving, raising unemployment. Looking at August's unemployment data, when the rate rose, people called it Sam's rule, causing a huge fuss. Looking at things like that, it's clear that market sentiment could be quite negative. The fear of a recession can lead to self-fulfilling prophecies, causing real impacts on the economy. That's why, from the Fed's perspective, adding 100,000 jobs a month isn't the solution. If they continue this way, the unemployment rate will rise. Secondly, from now on, if job losses occur due to tightening, the unemployment rate could spike. There's no solution to that. I think they're very aware of this. It seems the framework through which they view the labor market has shifted. 100,000 jobs won't cut it anymore. They'll need to create more than that. Now they have to start creating jobs. This isn't about maintaining the status quo. They'll need some kind of invisible stimulus. Secondly, from now on, they must take every possible step to prevent job losses from occurring. That's why they considered a 50 basis point cut this time, as it aligns with their current view of the labor market's fragility. If you take a close look at the FOMC's summary of economic projections, you'll notice they've directly referenced this concern. Back in June, they projected the unemployment rate would finish the year at 4.0%, not expecting it to rise significantly beyond that. But now, it's projected to reach 4.4%. It's increased quite a bit. Even though the Fed says they'll cut rates 4 times by the end of the year, the unemployment rate is still expected to stay at 4. This means it's now easier for the unemployment rate to rise compared to the past, as the economy has become more fragile. They expected it to be around 4.2 or 4.1, but it's now holding steady at 4.4 for a while. Despite these rate cuts, this indicates something deeper about the underlying conditions in the labor market. It indicates that from now on, there's a much higher possibility of the unemployment rate spiking. The structure has changed. It's a different game now, and it seems like the Fed is recognizing that. So this has become a surprising realization for them. In the end, that's why the Fed decided on the 50 basis point cut. That's how I interpret it.
Yes, that makes perfect sense. It's very convincing. Given this context, the dot plot projections also appear reasonable and align well with their overall strategic approach.
Now the dot plot has been revised and all that. But one thing that genuinely surprised me during this FOMC meeting was a reporter asked, "What about housing market inflation? Home prices have certainly gone up, haven't they?" Powell responded, well, this is actually quite difficult to address. What's difficult? Raising interest rates has kept fixed rate mortgages around. So people treat those low interest loans like a badge of honor. Why would they sell their homes? That's why there's no inventory. So if we lower interest rates, wouldn't more homes come onto the market? So the reporter asked, if we lower interest rates, are you saying home prices will drop? That's what it sounds like, right? Then Powell made an intriguing point, saying, reducing interest rates could lead to more homes being listed, but it would also undoubtedly increase the number of eager prospective buyers entering the market. So even if more homes are listed, more buyers don't necessarily mean prices will fall, right? He concluded saying, that's not something the Fed can control. I may have said that a bit humorously, but let's take a moment to consider this. Let's briefly look at this article. It was translated by the Korea Economic Daily. The question was, what are you going to do about home prices? The response was, people are holding on to their low-interest mortgages, so refinancing is too expensive and they aren't selling. So raising rates won't fix that. But if rates go down, people will finally sell and move, leading to more homes on the market. Then you might think prices will drop, but new buyers will also emerge in the market. The real issue is that there simply aren't enough homes available. We all know that. You, me, and everyone else knows it. It's hard to find land in places where people want to live, and every aspect of housing is becoming more difficult. This is not a problem the Fed can solve. It's a supply issue that the market and the government need to address. Then he wrapped it up. Basically, he's saying, this is out of our hands, right?
Then what does the central bank say?
So, from the Fed's perspective, if you take a look at the article above, here's what they are clearly stating. It could take several years, definitely not just 1 or 2, for housing inflation to gradually go away.
Does that mean they will choose to exclude housing from their inflation considerations moving forward in their assessments and evaluations?
They won't exclude it, but they'll likely take it into consideration in a different way. So here's the thing, they still need to address it. So they're saying, sure, if we could control it with high interest rates, you'd be right, but we really can't fix it. And if we try, are we willing to risk everything else, including the labor market, just to address that one issue? That's why they're not going to consider going down that path. So from the Fed's perspective, they're essentially declaring that they don't know what to do about rising home prices.
That's very different from the Bank of Korea.
The system is indeed different, isn't it? There are various factors and nuances that set it apart, right?
We have variable interest rates.
Yes, the systems are different. In Korea, lowering rates won't necessarily lead to more homes being listed. Chairman Powell, for example, has probably rarely seen a case where the housing market has been so dominated by fixed-rate mortgages like this. It's hard to make a direct comparison, but I think he's reflecting on different factors here, because the Fed has a dual mandate. They have to balance both inflation and growth. And of course, they also need to maintain maximum employment. So they can't afford to risk messing up everything else just because they want to tackle this sticky housing inflation issue. So, in a way, they're distancing themselves, saying, this isn't our issue, this isn't our responsibility. Instead, they seem to be targeting employment now by implementing the 50 basis point cut. That's how I would interpret it.
I see. Are there any other key points worth discussing?
Looking at the Fed cases, let me mention one last important thing before we move on. It seems to be closely related to how they perceive the neutral interest rate and its implications.
That's what we are curious about. Where will the interest rate ultimately stop?
They lowered the rate by 50 basis points this time, but there was one notable person who opposed this move. It was Michelle Bowman, one of the board members, and she's considered a hawk. Quite hawkish, actually, in her views. Michelle Bowman is also a governor, and she's on the board of the Fed. She holds a significant position. I'm not sure, but I've been watching the market since 2004. I remember back in 2005 or 2006, a few regional Fed presidents voted against the decision. James Bullard did it, and so did Esther George, among others. That's possible because they could say, our region is different. They represent their region's interests, and that's understandable. But I don't really remember a Fed board member casting a dissenting vote. I can't recall it. Yet, a board member voted against this time. I only read about it in a book. I have never seen it myself. There's this hallway in the Fed near where the chair's office is. Apparently, before the FOMC meetings, they bring in all the board members and put them on the hot seat. Like, let's go this way going forward. That's how the Fed chair persuades them. Even Ben Bernanke used to do this. When it was time to spend money, the hawks would say, no, absolutely not. Then they'd be convinced with, let's try it and stop if things go wrong. There seems to be a manual of sorts for persuading hawks. But when hawks are involved and you propose a 50 basis point cut, they'll definitely put up a fight. So they probably spent a lot of time figuring out how to convince them. This is what they came up with. The best way to persuade hawks is to convince them that we are focusing on the long term. If we cut by just 25 basis points and a recession hits, we'll have to cut much more later. But if we cut by 50 basis points now, we won't have to cut as much later because the real economy will hold up better. So for the greater good in the future, let's cut more now to prevent bigger cuts later. It's like giving a preventive shot. That's how they could convince them.
Ultimately, they're trying to maintain high rates.
Right. And from the hawk's perspective, it makes sense. And when the chair comes into your office and talks for a while, it doesn't seem like you'll leave without agreeing. But Bowman still cast her dissenting vote like no way despite all that, but that's how they operate. In the end, the idea is to cut more now so that they can cut less later. If they choose to cut a lot now, they can immediately support the growth of the American economy. The growth is solid and organic, and that way the US's potential growth rate won't be damaged. Then there won't be a need to cut rates further. That's why the long-term neutral rates went up. This time, the longer-term rate actually climbed from 2.8 to 2.9. While most rates have dropped significantly compared to June's projections, they've actually raised the long-term rate. By lowering the rate this time, they're actually supporting the real economy's growth potential. That's the message here. So looking at the article, I want to share some thoughts. When Powell was asked if he thinks the era of significantly lowering rates will return, he basically said, "I don't know for sure, but personally, I don't think we'll return to the era where the neutral rate was negative. And now it seems the neutral rate has become significantly higher compared to then. How much higher? We don't know yet." That's what he said, but it seems we'll be operating at a higher long-term base than we did in the past. Yes, I think this was Chairman Powell touching base on this subject once again.
The real interest rate, considering inflation.
Exactly, so we can see this from the content. Now, to summarize, we had the central bank week recently. We haven't seen the BOJ yet, but although they kept rates unchanged, I haven't watched the press conference, but if you look closely in Europe, they're starting to think about quantitative tightening. So the Fed will likely continue grappling with quantitative tightening. They're going to have to continue battling the market, which will want them to end it quickly. But Powell has thrown a bit of a curveball here. First, there's the hawkish aspect of this case. Second, raising the neutral rate is another hawkish aspect. These are two key points. Another question is then, why did the Fed rush to lower by 50 basis points? This would be how they explained it to the hawks. This way we won't have to cut as much later. To the doves, they said, the framework has changed. We need to prevent unemployment from rising as more job losses will put us in serious trouble.
It seems like they've realized the framework has changed a bit late, if that's the case.
Yes, when I looked at the press conference, they mentioned this. Let me check again. During the press conference, Neil Irwin asked a question, and this is what Chairman Powell had to say. He said that job creation heavily depends on labor force participation. He's pointing out that many immigrants have entered the labor market. If only 100,000 jobs are created while millions join, the unemployment rate will inevitably rise. This is the first point. And if you see below, the second question isn't particularly important. The entire committee thought that because there are too many job openings and too many job seekers, we might reach a point on the curve where this leads to an increase in unemployment or job losses. This is called the Beveridge curve, but let's skip that for now. We are very close to, or may have already reached that point. So if job openings decrease further, it will directly lead to unemployment. What this means is there are no excess jobs left. It's now a one-to-one match. So any decrease from here will result in an increase in unemployment. So this FOMC press conference had a lot of important details to listen to. Personally, it was pretty shocking. So far, Powell has been giving rather ambiguous, iffy statements, but this time, he worked very hard to provide a detailed justification for the 50 basis point cut. So I think this was an opportunity where we could really get a good sense what the Fed is thinking and struggling with.
Yes, in fact, they may have been hiding those concerns under inflation issues all along. Then there's the important question many people are asking. Are we recognizing the start of a recession, and are we perhaps reacting a bit too late? If that's the case, with the time lag in policy responses, some might suggest that we should assume it will be difficult to prevent the recession and plan our investments accordingly. Or is it more like, no, inflation has been mostly controlled, the economy isn't that bad, and we're just lowering the rates we previously raised due to inflation, so there's nothing major to worry about? Which perspective should we adopt moving forward?
On August 5th, it was described as a yen carry trade unwinding, but in fact it was actually due to fears of a US recession. The Fed and the Bank of Japan probably realized how serious it could be after seeing that unfold. Then they likely thought, wow, this is scarier than we thought. The unemployment rate is rising for reasons other than this, and it's still concerning. The Fed must have realized that the public sentiment toward a recession is quite peculiar. So while we're not yet seeing clear signs of a recession, if the recession comes and the unemployment rate jumps, as I mentioned earlier, people start making it a self-fulfilling prophecy. when people keep saying the recession is here and they stop spending money, don't they? An actual recession hits. So the Fed seems very committed to taking on any and every possible measure to preemptively defend against that. Personally, I'm not entirely certain whether a recession is on the horizon or not, but I do believe there's ample room for the Fed to make a mistake. If a recession does hit, I firmly believe it will be largely because the Fed made an error in judgment. The reason for a potential Fed mistake goes back to what we discussed earlier regarding their policies and approach. The market has become too smart for its own good. It almost reacts too quickly to policy measures now. The market has significantly outsmarted the Fed, picking up on signals much faster than it ever did in the past. So from the Fed's point of view, even the Bank of Korea's governor made a comment about this. He said, the rates have dropped too much and we haven't even lowered rates yet. Because we have to realize everyone is anticipating it. It's bound to go down. Everyone is waiting for it to happen because they've learned too much. So even before the rates are officially lowered, they've already dropped. Then just adjust to match it, right? This is the tiger from the sun and moon story. The tiger doesn't just take one rice cake. It will appear at the next ridge. So when do you decide to go home? The sun and moon will come to find you, but the tiger ultimately meets its end while pursuing this. The market will keep coming back to take everything it can get. It's an endless cycle, really. From the Fed's perspective, they can't fill in for the market forever. They do their best to satisfy market expectations, but at some point, things have to change for overall economic health. This creates a kind of discrepancy in the economic landscape. So if we're looking to identify risks, particularly recession risks, I believe the Fed is in a very challenging position. The market has become incredibly savvy, and the Fed now has to orchestrate a soft landing while keeping that in mind. This is a significantly more difficult task compared to what they faced in the past. As I mentioned earlier, it's like everyone has a navigation system, which means the market reacts so fast. It's not easy being the Fed.
The economy is susceptible to immediate turns, depending significantly on the behavior of the market participants involved. Very curious to see how people will react to these indicators. From the Fed's perspective, they can't fill in for the market forever, no matter how much they want to. They do their best to satisfy market expectations, but at some point, things have to change for overall economic health. Well, we received some great insights and thorough interpretations of the FOMC's actions, all thanks to Director Oh Gun Young's expertise and perspective.
Yes, thank you kindly.